stand beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia today, and you are standing inside a building that was already 900 years old when Columbus sailed. Above you, golden mosaics of Christ share the walls with the calligraphy of Allah. Outside, the call to prayer drifts over ramparts that once guarded the richest city of the medieval world. Most people know that Rome fell. Fewer know that Rome did not simply fall. It moved east, and it survived here for another 1,000 years. This city broke armies and outlasted plagues. Its scribes guarded books that later centuries would use to rebuild the West. And on one morning in May of 1453, it made one of the most dramatic last stands in human history. This is the entire story of Constantinople, a city that a whole world fought over, again and again, for more than 2,000 years, because of one thing it could never stop being, the place where the world had to cross. Let's begin where the city begins, at the edge of the water. Chapter 1. The city before the city. Before the emperors. Before the golden domes. Before the name Constantinople existed at all. There was a fishing town on a triangle of land where two continents almost touch. To understand why this place mattered more than almost any other piece of ground on the planet, you have to look at the water. The Bosphorus is a narrow strait, in places less than half a mile wide, and it is one of the strangest waterways on Earth. It connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and through the Marmara and the Dardanelles, to the Mediterranean and everything beyond. Europe stands on one bank. Asia stands on the other. A strong swimmer can cross it. And yet this thin ribbon of water divides two continents and joins two worlds. Every ship carrying grain from the rich lands north of the Black Sea, every cargo of fish, timber, furs, and slaves moving south, every load of wine, oil, and silver moving north, all of it had to pass through this strait. There was no other way. Whoever controlled the Bosphorus did not need to conquer the world. The world would come to them and pay for the privilege of passing through. Now look at the European side. A peninsula pushes out into the water, shaped roughly like a triangle. On one side runs the Sea of Marmara. On another runs a long, deep, sheltered inlet that later ages would call the Golden Horn, one of the finest natural harbors of the ancient world. Water protects two of the three sides. Only one landward edge needs a wall, a defensible peninsula, a superb harbor, and a choke point on one of the most valuable trade routes in existence, all in the same place. Cities have been founded on far less, and people understood that very early. According to Greek tradition, colonists from the city of Megara founded a settlement here around 667 BC and named it Byzantion, after their legendary leader, a man called Byzas. Like most founding stories from the ancient world, the details are more legend than record, and historians treat the exact date with caution. But the Greek colony itself was very real, and it gave the place a name that would echo for more than 2,000 years. And with the founding comes one of the great stories of the ancient world. 17 years before Byzantion was born. So the tradition goes. Another group of Greek colonists had arrived in this same strait. They looked at both shores, and they chose to build their city on the Asian side, at a place called Chalcedon. Flat ground, decent farmland, easy to settle. They looked directly across the water at the magnificent triangle of land with its deep sheltered harbor, and they passed it by. The ancient world never let them forget it. The historian Herodotus records that a Persian general, seeing the two cities generations later, remarked that the founders of Chalcedon must have been blind, because, with a perfect sight staring them in the face, They chose the worst one, the land of the blind. That is what the ancients called Chalcedon. And the joke survived for centuries, because everyone who sailed through the strait could see the point of it with their own eyes. That old joke carries a warning inside it. The value of this place was never a secret, which means the town built here would never be left in peace. A location that valuable is a location that everyone wants. That is the blessing and the curse that runs through this entire story. For the next 25 centuries, all the way to the shipping headlines of our own time, Byzantium learned the lesson quickly. The town grew rich on the water, taxing and servicing the grain ships that moved between the Black Sea and the hungry cities of Greece. Athens, in its golden age, depended on that Black Sea grain to feed itself, which meant Athens depended on this strait, which meant Byzantium, a modest town of fishermen and traders, sat with its hand resting on the throat of the greatest powers of the age. Powers do not like hands on their throats. And so, for century after century, Byzantium was fought over. The Persian Empire took it. The Greeks took it back. During the long war between Athens and Sparta, the town changed hands as both sides fought for control of the grain route. The successors of Alexander the Great squabbled over the region, and Gallic war bands forced the town to pay tribute. Byzantium survived it all, not because it was strong, but because it was too useful to destroy. Conquerors did not want to burn the toll booth. They wanted to own it. Then, in the 2nd century AD, the town made the one mistake its location could not forgive. It picked the wrong side in a Roman civil war. When two Roman generals fought for the imperial throne in the years 192 and 193, Byzantium backed a man named Pescennius Niger. The winner was a different man, Septimius Severus, and he intended to make an example of the city that had defied him. His forces besieged Byzantium, and the town, protected by its walls and its harbour, held out with astonishing stubbornness. Ancient accounts describe a siege lasting years, with the defenders reduced to desperate measures before they finally surrendered around 196. Severus tore down the walls. He stripped the town of its status and its privileges. For a moment, it looked as though the city on the Bosphorus might simply be erased. What happened instead tells you everything about the power of this location. Severus himself, the man who had broken Byzantium, rebuilt it. He raised new walls, laid out new streets, built baths and porticos, and the foundations of a great arena for chariot racing, a structure later ages would know as the Hippodrome. The emperor who came to destroy the city ended up enlarging it. Because the map had not changed, the strait was still the strait. The grain ships still had nowhere else to go. You could punish this city. You could burn it. What you could not do was make its location stop mattering. Keep that pattern in mind, because you will see it again and again. This city will be starved, burned, betrayed, and broken, and it will be rebuilt every single time, by friends and enemies alike, because the water never stops mattering. By the early 300s AD, the rebuilt Byzantium was a handsome, prosperous, medium-sized provincial city, respected, useful, and unremarkable. Nothing about it suggested that it was about to become the center of a world. For that, it needed one man, a man with the power to remake the map, the imagination to see what this triangle of land could become, and the audacity to bet an empire on it. In the year 324, that man arrived on the Bosphorus with an army at his back. His name was Constantine. Chapter 2. Constantine's Gamble. To understand why a Roman emperor would walk away from Rome, you first have to understand something most people never learn in school. By the time Constantine came to power, Rome, the city, and Rome the empire were no longer the same thing. The 3rd century had nearly killed the empire. For 50 years, from 235 to 284, Rome tore itself apart in a storm of civil wars, plagues, invasion, and economic collapse. Emperors rose and fell so fast that some barely ruled long enough to mint coins. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing centuries later, would famously chart the long decline that began in this era. But even people living through it understood that something fundamental had broken. And one detail from that crisis matters most for our story. During that terrible century, the emperors themselves stopped living in Rome, not because they hated the city, but because the city was in the wrong place. The wars that decided the empire's fate were being fought on the Danube frontier and against Persia in the east. Rome sat hundreds of miles from both. An emperor in Rome learned about disasters weeks after they happened, so the rulers moved to working capitals closer to the action. Cities like Milan, Trier, and Nicomedia. Rome kept the Senate, the monuments, and the prestige. The power had already left. The empire that survived this crisis was reorganized, militarized, and increasingly Eastern in its center of gravity. The East held the richer provinces, the bigger cities, the older trade routes. The East held the money. Any clear-eyed observer around the year 300 could see where the future was leaning. What no one could predict was the man who would make it official. Constantine was born around 272 in the Balkans, the son of an army officer who rose to become one of the empire's co-rulers. And that phrase, co-rulers, points at the political machine Constantine grew up inside. The emperor Diocletian, trying to end the chaos, had divided imperial power among 4 men, 2 senior emperors and 2 juniors, a system historians call the tetrarchy. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was a recipe for civil war. The moment ambitious men stopped cooperating, they stopped cooperating almost immediately. In 306, Constantine's father died at York, in Britain, and the army there proclaimed young Constantine emperor on the spot. Hold that image for a second. The man who would found the greatest city of the medieval world was first acclaimed emperor at the rainy northwestern edge of the known world, about as far from the Bosphorus as the Roman map could take you. Nothing about his rise was inevitable. He fought for every mile. For 18 years, Constantine climbed over his rivals, one civil war at a time. The most famous moment came in 312, at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, where he defeated his rival, Maxentius. Ancient Christian writers, especially the bishop Eusebius, who knew Constantine personally, tell us the emperor credited this victory to a vision from the Christian God and had his soldiers mark their shields with a Christian symbol. Historians still debate what exactly Constantine experienced and when his personal conversion truly happened. What is not debated is what he did next. Within a year, Christianity went from a persecuted faith to a protected one. One of the most consequential religious decisions in European history had been made by a general in the middle of a power struggle. But one rival remained. Licinius ruled the east. Constantine ruled the west. And the empire was not big enough for both of them. Their final war ended in 324. And its decisive moments happened at the doorstep of our story, near the old city of Byzantium itself. When Licinius surrendered, Constantine stood on that triangle of land as the sole master of the Roman world, looking at the same waters we looked at a moment ago. Most victorious emperors would have held a triumph and gone home. Constantine looked at the map, looked at the harbor, and made the decision that gives this chapter its name. He would build a new capital, not a working headquarters like Milan or Nicomedia, but a full, permanent, deliberate rival to Rome itself. A new Rome, And he would build it here. Weigh the audacity of that for a moment. Rome was not just a city. It was 1,000 years of identity. It was the Senate, the temples, the tombs of the ancestors, the entire mythology of what it meant to be Roman. Moving the capital was, in symbolic terms, something close to sacrilege. Later legend even claimed that Constantine personally paced out the new city's boundaries, walking far beyond the old walls, and that when his companions asked how much farther he would go, he answered that he would keep walking until the invisible guide, walking ahead of him, stopped. The story is almost certainly polished by legend, but it captures how people remembered the project. This was not administration. This was destiny, announced in real estate. The construction was a sprint. Work began around 324, and the city was formally dedicated on May 11th, 330, a date the city would celebrate for more than 1,000 years. Constantine enlarged the old hippodrome until it could hold tens of thousands of spectators. He laid out a grand central avenue, a forum with a towering column carrying his own statue, palaces, baths, and harbours to fill the public spaces. Artworks and monuments were stripped from cities and sanctuaries across the empire and shipped to the Bosphorus. One of them, the serpent column from Delphi, cast by the Greeks to celebrate their victory over Persia 8 centuries earlier, still stands in Istanbul today. In the open air, on the ground of the ancient hippodrome, you can walk up and look at it this afternoon. And because emperors understood incentives, Constantine did not wait for people to love his city. He paid them to free bread for residents, modelled on the grain dole of Rome, privileges for senators willing to relocate. The population surged within a single generation. Officially, the city was called New Rome. Almost nobody called it that. From the beginning, people called it what it obviously was: the city of Constantine, Constantinople. Constantine died in 337, baptized on his deathbed, and was buried not in Rome, but in his own city. In a mausoleum he designed himself. Historians can argue about his faith, his character, and his cruelty, and they do, because he could be ruthless even by Roman standards, executing his own eldest son and his wife in circumstances that remain murky. But his two great bets, on Christianity and on the Bosphorus, turned out to be two of the most accurate predictions in the history of power. He bet on the winning religion and the winning location, decades before either outcome was obvious. Rome, the city, would be sacked within a century of his death. Constantine's city would hold off every foreign army for nearly 900 years. And when its walls were finally breached, the men who broke in would not be the enemy anyone expected. That reckoning waits for us later in the journey. First, the city had to survive the century that killed its western twin. Because a capital is only as strong as what stands between it and its enemies. And in the generations after Constantine, the storm that destroyed half the Roman world came within a few hundred yards of destroying his city too. What saved it was a wall, perhaps the most successful wall ever built. Chapter 3. The Walls That Saved an Empire. Every American schoolchild learns a simple sentence. Rome fell in 476. Like most simple sentences about history, it is half true, and the missing half changes everything. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire was formerly run as two halves: a Western Empire governed from Italy and an Eastern Empire governed from Constantinople. The two halves shared a name, a law, and a self-image, but they faced very different circumstances. And when the great storm of invasions came, one half died, and the other half did not. The storm had many names: Goths, Huns, Vandals, and a dozen other peoples, set in motion across Eurasia in a chain reaction of migration and war. In 378, at Adrianople, barely 150 miles from Constantinople, a Gothic army destroyed an Eastern Roman field army and killed the Emperor Valens himself. The contemporary historian Ammianus Marcellinus treated it as one of the great catastrophes of the age. The road to the capital lay open, and the capital's defences at that moment were still, more or less, the old walls of Constantine, which the city had already outgrown. Constantinople survived that crisis, but the lesson was unmistakable. The city was too important, and too exposed, to gamble again. And so, in the early 400s, under the Emperor Theodosius II, who inherited the throne as a child while his officials ran the state, Constantinople built the thing that would define it for 1,000 years. We call them the Theodosian Walls. And calling them walls almost undersells them. Picture a defensive system, roughly 4 miles long, sealing the entire land side of the peninsula from water to water. An attacker coming from the west faced, first, a moat, beyond the moat, a low outer rampart. Beyond that, an outer wall studded with towers. Beyond that, a killing ground, and then the great inner wall, a massive barrier rising roughly 40 feet, carrying dozens of towers that loomed even higher. An assault had to survive 3 layers deep of missiles, stone, and fire before touching the main defenses. As a complete system, nothing else in the ancient or medieval West matched it, and the timing was almost unbelievable. The great land wars were completed in the 14s. Within a generation, there arrived before them the most feared military force on the planet. Attila. The Huns were horse archers of terrifying speed, and under Attila they had built a tribute empire that squeezed both halves of the Roman world. In the 440s, Hunnic armies rampaged through the Balkans, destroying cities that had stood for centuries. And then, in 447, a sequence of earthquakes threw down long stretches of Constantinople's new walls, towers and all, at the worst possible moment. With Attila's forces in the field, what happened next deserves to be more famous than it is. The city's population, organized by its officials and by the rival chariot racing factions of the Hippodrome, the same fan clubs that normally existed to scream at races, rebuilt the fortifications in a matter of weeks. Inscriptions celebrating the reconstruction survive to this day. When the Huns approached, the walls were standing again. Attila, whose armies excelled in open country but had limited patience for long sieges of powerful fortifications, took his tribute money and turned west instead. The walls did not defeat him. They convinced him not to try. That sequence, in miniature, is the story of the entire 5th century. The Western Empire bled from wounds it could not close. Britain was abandoned. Gaul and Spain, filled with Gothic and Vandal kingdoms. North Africa, the tax engine that funded the Western government, fell to the Vandals. And with it went the money that paid the Western armies. Rome itself was sacked twice, by the Goths in 410 and by the Vandals in 455. The Eastern Empire suffered defeats and paid humiliating tributes, but its core survived every crisis, and one reason towers over the rest. Its heart could not be stabbed. Enemies could burn the Balkans, and did. Repeatedly, they could not touch the capital, the treasury, the mint, the bureaucracy, or the emperor. The state could always reload. Modern historians argue in detail about why the West collapsed. Scholars like Peter Heather and Brian Ward Perkins, and they weigh many causes, from barbarian pressure to internal decay. No serious account rests on geography alone. The East also had richer provinces, shorter frontier, and steadier revenues. But few historians would deny the walls their share of the verdict. A safe capital meant the Eastern government could lose battles without losing the state. Constantinople is a large part of the reason there was still a Roman Empire when the 5th century ended. And so we arrive at 476. The famous date. In that year, a Germanic officer named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy with the almost poetic name Romulus Augustulus, and did not bother appointing a new one. He shipped the imperial regalia east to Constantinople, with a message that amounted to this: the West no longer needs its own emperor. One emperor in your city is enough. Notice what that means. Even the man who ended the Western Empire did not claim Rome had fallen. In the eyes of everyone involved, the Roman Empire continued, whole and legitimate, with its capital on the Bosphorus. The people of Constantinople never called themselves Byzantines, a label invented by later scholars. They called themselves Romans, in Greek, Romaioi, and they would keep calling themselves Romans until the very last day of this story, nearly 1,000 years later. So the next time someone tells you Rome fell in 476, you can offer them the fuller sentence. Half of Rome fell. The other half, the richer half, the half behind the strongest walls of its world, stood on the shore of the Bosphorus and kept the lights on. But surviving is not the same as thriving. As the 500s opened, the Empire of Constantinople was a fortress state that had endured the storm. What it needed now was ambition. What it got was the most extraordinary power couple of the entire medieval world. A peasant's nephew who reached for the whole lost West, and a woman who rose from the arena floor to the throne itself and saved it. Their names were Justinian and Theodora, and their story begins in the Hippodrome. Chapter 4. Justinian and Theodora. Every great city has one generation that defines it. For Constantinople, that generation began with an old soldier from the Balkans. His name was Justin. He had walked to Constantinople as a young peasant, joined the palace guard, and climbed the ranks for decades until, in 518, at nearly 70 years old, he maneuvered his way onto the throne itself. The sources of the period, some of them openly hostile, portray him as a rough man of little education, by some accounts barely literate. Whatever the truth of that, the fact of his rise is one of the great overlooked features of this empire. And it repeats throughout our story. Constantinople was a ladder. A swineherd's son could die an emperor. Almost nowhere else on earth in the 500s was that sentence even thinkable. But Justin's real gift to history was his nephew. He brought the boy to the capital, gave him the best education money could buy, and groomed him for power. The nephew took the name Justinian. And, when his uncle died in 527, he inherited the throne with a mind full of enormous ideas. Rebuild the law, rebuild the city, and most audacious of all, take back the lost western half of the empire. He also inherited something the old aristocracy could never forgive: a wife from the very bottom of society. Theodora's story comes to us mostly from the historian Procopius, who worked at the heart of Justinian's government and wrote its official histories. Late in life, Procopius also wrote a second, secret book, so venomous about the imperial couple that historians have argued ever since about how much of it to believe. But the outline is consistent. Theodora was the daughter of a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome. She grew up in the entertainment world of the arena, working as an actress, a profession so scandalous in Roman law that senators were forbidden to marry such women. Justinian was so determined to marry her that the law itself was changed to allow it. Understand what that meant to the elite of Constantinople. The Empress of the Romans was a woman many of them had once watched perform on a stage. They never forgot it, and in 532, they nearly used it to destroy her. Put yourself in the Hippodrome on a January afternoon that year. You are one of perhaps 50,000 people packed onto the marble benches. The races are about to start, but nobody is watching the gates. The two great fan factions, the Blues and the Greens, enemies on every other day of the year, are chanting together. One word, over and over, rolling around the stone bowl of the arena like thunder. Nika, Nika, Nika. Victory. It is not a cheer anymore. It is a demand aimed at the palace next door, and somewhere behind those palace walls, an emperor is listening and beginning to be afraid. The riot that took its name from that chant became one of the most destructive urban uprisings in ancient history. A botched execution and a pile of grievances had fused the factions into a single furious crowd. For days, the mob ruled the city. They burned the center of Constantinople, including the cathedral itself, and proclaimed a rival emperor in the very arena where the chanting had begun. Inside the palace, Justinian prepared to run. Ships waited in the harbor, and at that moment, according to Procopius, Theodora stood up in the council chamber and refused. He records her saying that flight might be safety, but that she would rather die as an empress than live as a fugitive. And he gives her a line that became immortal, that the imperial purple makes a fine burial shroud. Historians debate whether the speech is her exact words or the writer's polish. What no one disputes is the outcome. Justinian stayed. What followed was one of the darkest days in the city's history. The generals Belisarius and Mundus led troops into the Hippodrome, sealed the exits, and turned the arena into a killing ground. Procopius reports that around 30,000 people died there. Other ancient sources give figures even higher, and modern historians treat all such numbers with caution. But even by conservative reading, the state massacred many thousands of its own citizens in a single afternoon. In the same arena where they had cheered races the week before, Justinian's throne was saved by blood on sand. And then, out of the ashes, came the building. The burned cathedral had to be replaced, and Justinian saw an opportunity to make a statement no one could ignore. He hired not traditional architects, but two brilliant mathematicians, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and told them, in effect, to build something the world had never seen. Work began weeks after the riot. 5 years and 10 months later, in 537, it was finished. Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. The numbers are stunning even now. A dome, roughly 100 feet across, floating more than 180 feet above the marble floor, pierced by a ring of windows so that the crown of the building seems to hover on light. For roughly 1,000 years, it would remain the largest cathedral in the Christian world. The court writers record that Justinian, entering the finished church, compared his achievement to the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and claimed to have surpassed it, whether or not he truly spoke those words. The building itself makes the argument. You saw it in our opening. Almost 15 centuries later, it is still standing, and it is still the reason many visitors come to this city at all. Justinian's ambitions did not stop at architecture. His legal experts compressed 1,000 years of chaotic Roman law into an organized code, the corpus of civil law, which centuries later would become a foundation of legal systems across continental Europe and beyond. Rulings drafted beside the Bosphorus still echo in courtrooms on the far side of the world. And his general, Belisarius, with armies often shockingly small, took back North Africa from the Vandals and fought his way up Italy, until, for one brief historical moment, Rome itself answered again to a Roman emperor, ruling from Constantinople. Stand in the year 540, and the impossible seemed underway. The Mediterranean was becoming a Roman lake again. Then the empire was struck by an enemy no wall could stop. In 541, plague entered the Roman world, most likely traveling the Mediterranean trade routes, and quite possibly aboard the grain ships that fed the capital from Egypt. Modern researchers, studying DNA recovered from graves of the period, have confirmed the pathogen was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium behind the later Black Death. When it reached Constantinople in 542, Procopius was in the city, and his description reads like the end of the world. He writes of the dead beyond counting, of bodies filling the towers of the sea walls because burial could not keep pace. Exact death tolls are impossible to verify, and historians argue over the plague's full demographic impact. But few doubt that the capital lost a terrifying share of its people within months. Justinian himself caught the disease and survived. The empire survived too, but the golden hour had passed. The reconquered lands proved ruinously expensive to hold. The treasury drained. Theodora died of illness in 548, and contemporaries noticed that something in Justinian dimmed. He lived on until 565. An old man, ruling half awake over an exhausted state, still dreaming in law codes and dedications. The verdict on Justinian is still an open argument, and honest historians keep both files open. Either he overreached catastrophically, spending the East's strength on a West it could not keep, or he gave Roman civilization one last blaze of glory that produced the law and the cathedral. Two of the most durable achievements in European history. Perhaps both verdicts are true at once. Picture him at the end, an old man, alone in a marble palace, the greatest builder of his age, outliving his wife, his generals, his money, and his dreams. While in the harbor below, fewer ships arrive every year. The city he leaves behind is magnificent, exhausted, and about to be tested as no Christian city had ever been tested. Because, far to the east and far to the south, new storms were already forming. Chapter 5. The Sieges and the Fire that Burned on Water. Historians sometimes play a grim game with the century you are about to enter. Remove Constantinople from the map in the 600s or the early 700s. They ask, and what stands between the armies of the new caliphate and the open lands of Europe? The honest answer is that no one can know how that alternate world unfolds. Counterfactual history is interpretation, not fact. But the fact that serious scholars keep asking the question tells you what this chapter is. It is the story of the closest the city ever came to extinction, and of why its survival mattered far beyond its own walls. It began with a war that historians sometimes call the last great war of antiquity. In the early 600s, the Roman Empire and Persia, rivals for 7 centuries, finally went for each other's throats, and Rome was losing. Persian armies took Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, the richest provinces of the empire. In 614, they took Jerusalem and carried off the relic venerated as the true cross. A spiritual catastrophe as much as a military one. Refugees streamed toward the Bosphorus. The empire's tax base was amputated. By any reasonable accounting, the Roman state was dying. The emperor of this disaster was a man named Heraclius, and his response ranks among the boldest gambles in military history. Rather than defend what remained, he took the field army, left his capital, and marched east to attack Persia at its heart, betting everything on one question: could the city defend itself without him? In 626, The question was answered. A Persian army reached the Asian shore opposite Constantinople. At the same moment, from the west, came the Avars, steppe conquerors, driving tens of thousands of warriors and their Slav subjects against the land walls. The capital of the Roman world was caught between two hostile armies, with its emperor 1,000 miles away. What followed became one of the founding legends of the city. The defenders, led by the patriarch Sergius and the city's officials, held the Theodosian walls against massed assaults, while the Roman navy destroyed the flotillas trying to ferry attackers across the water. Accounts from the period describe the patriarch carrying an icon of the Virgin Mary along the ramparts, and the people of Constantinople came to believe, with total conviction, that the Mother of God herself had defended her city. Tradition links a great hymn of thanksgiving, the Akathist, to that deliverance, and though scholars debate when the hymn was actually composed, it is still sung in Orthodox churches today. 14 centuries later, the memory of 626 is still alive in liturgy. The siege broke, the Avar power faded, and Heraclius, against every expectation, smashed Persia in the east and dictated peace as a victor. In 630, he returned the true cross to Jerusalem in triumph. Two ancient superpowers had fought to the death, and Rome had won. It was the most expensive victory in the empire's history. Both giants were left bankrupt, bled white, their armies gutted, their provinces devastated. And at exactly that moment, out of Arabia, came something entirely new. The armies of Islam emerged in the 630s, united by a new faith and moving with astonishing speed. Syria fell, Jerusalem fell, Egypt fell, Persia, the 1,000-year empire, collapsed completely. Within a single generation, the Roman Empire lost more than half its territory. Forever, refugees and soldiers fell back toward Anatolia, and everyone understood where the new power would strike next. The city of the Caesars, the prize of prizes. The first great attempt came in the 670s, when Arab fleets and armies operated against Constantinople across several campaigning seasons. Sources for these decades are patchy, and historians debate the exact shape of the blockade. But tradition ties this struggle to a moment of legend. A Greek-speaking refugee from conquered Syria, an architect or engineer named Kallinikos, arrived in Constantinople carrying a secret. We call it Greek fire. The Romans called it liquid fire, or sea fire. It was a petroleum-based incendiary mixture, projected from siphons mounted on warships. A flamethrower at sea. 6 centuries early, it clung to wood, to sails, to skin. Water did not put it out. By some accounts, it burned even on the surface of the sea itself, so that sailors leaping from their ships jumped from one fire into another. And one detail turns the weapon into a legend. The making of it was a state secret, guarded at the highest level. Its full process known, by the accounts we have, only to a very few. No surviving source records the complete formula. Modern scholars can reconstruct the general chemistry, likely a distilled petroleum base delivered under pressure. But the precise recipe and the exact workings of the projection system remain uncertain to this day. Whatever the full truth of it was, the empire never wrote it down anywhere that survived. Against the Arab fleets, the effect was decisive. The attacks of the 670s broke against the walls and the fire, and the caliphate accepted a truce. But everyone knew they would come back. And in 717, they came back with everything. The siege of 717 and 718 was one of the largest military operations the early medieval world ever saw. Arab sources and Roman chronicles together describe a vast army crossing into Europe to invest the land walls, supported by war fleets numbering, by the chronicles' counts, well over 1,000 vessels. The numbers in medieval sources are likely inflated, as such numbers usually are, but the scale was extraordinary by any reading. This was not a raid. This was an attempt to end the Roman Empire. The city was ready. A new emperor had just seized power. A hard-bitten soldier from the Syrian frontier who took the name Leo III. He had spent his career fighting Arab armies and knew their methods intimately. Under his command, the defense became a masterclass. The walls held the land assault. Greek fire savaged the fleets in repeated naval actions. Leo's diplomacy brought the Bulgars, the new power in the Balkans, down on the besiegers' rear. And Bulgar attacks inflicted slaughter on the Arab camp. Then came the deadliest ally of all. The winter of 717 was ferocious, and the besieging army, camped in open country with failing supply lines, began to starve and freeze. Chroniclers on both sides describe an army reduced to eating its animals, and worse. In the summer of 718, the Caliphate gave the order to withdraw. The retreating fleet was wrecked by storms on the way home. Of the enormous force that had set out to take Constantinople, only a fraction returned. Consider what had just happened. In these same decades, Muslim armies had crossed from North Africa into Spain and taken most of it within a few years. Europe was being approached from both ends. In the West, the Frankish victory at Tours in 732 is famous, and American textbooks still mention it. The defense of Constantinople in 718 was larger in scale, and a case can be made that it was at least as consequential. Yet almost no one outside the field has heard of it. The historian John Julius Norwich argued flatly that if the city had fallen in 718, no power then existing in the Balkans or Italy could have stopped what came next. That is his interpretation, and interpretations of unfought wars can never be proven. What can be said with confidence is more modest and still remarkable. For as long as this city stood, the wealthiest and best organized power of the early Middle Ages stood guard at the land bridge between Asia and Europe. The door held, and the door mattered. The city had saved itself, but victory against the outside world left the empire alone with its own soul. And in the peace that followed, Constantinople turned inward and began tearing itself apart over a question that sounds impossibly abstract and became a matter of blood. Can a painting be holy, or is it an idol? Chapter 6. The War Against Images. Walk into any Orthodox church today, anywhere on earth, and you will be surrounded by faces. Christ, the Virgin, the saints, painted in that unmistakable style. Gold backgrounds, solemn eyes, gazing straight at you. These images are called icons, and to Orthodox believers, they are not decoration. They are windows into heaven. Now the part almost nobody knows. For more than a century, the empire that created this art tried to destroy it. Emperors ordered the images smashed, whitewashed, and painted over. Monks suffered, and some died defending paintings. Constantinople went to war with its own walls. The outcome permanently shaped Byzantine and Orthodox sacred art, and it echoed through Christian arguments about images far beyond the empire's borders. Arguments that would flare up again centuries later, in the Reformation. To understand this strange conflict, you have to take one idea seriously. In the medieval mind, images were not pictures. They were power. The trouble had been building for generations. The Christian empire had inherited a contradiction and lived with it uneasily. The 10 Commandments explicitly forbid making graven images for worship. Yet Christian devotion had grown ever more visual. By the 600s, icons were everywhere. on church walls, on city gates, carried into battle. Remember the siege of 626, when the patriarch paraded the icon of the Virgin along the ramparts, and the people credited her with saving the city. Somewhere along that road, a question began to whisper. Are we venerating God through these images? Or have we started worshipping paint and wood? Then came the 700s, and the whisper became a roar. Consider what the empire had just lived through. Half its territory lost in a single generation to the armies of Islam, a faith that strictly rejected religious images and kept winning battles. Then, earthquakes. And in 726, a terrifying volcanic eruption in the Aegean Sea that darkened the sky. To a medieval society, none of this was random. God was angry. The only question was why. The Emperor Leo III, the same soldier who had saved the city in 718, believed he knew the answer. The empire had fallen into idolatry, and God was punishing it. Around 726, by the account of chroniclers like Theophanes, Leo made his move, and tradition centers it on a single explosive act. Over the great ceremonial gate of the imperial palace hung a famous golden image of Christ. Leo ordered it taken down. According to the chronicles, a crowd of outraged citizens killed at least one of the officials carrying out the order on the spot, and the emperor answered with punishments. A caution is needed here, and it is bigger than usual. Nearly everything we know about this era was written decades later, by the side that venerated icons and won. Some modern historians suspect the earliest phase under Leo was less systematic than the chronicles claim, more policy drift than crusade. The sources describe a war beginning. The reality may have begun as a quarrel. Either way, it grew into the real thing. We call this movement iconoclasm, literally the smashing of images. Its supporters saw themselves as purifiers of the faith. Its enemies called them heretics at war with heaven. Leo's son, Constantine V, took the policy much further. He was a gifted general and administrator, and by the hostile sources that survive, a persecutor of genuine cruelty. In 754, he convened a church council that formally condemned the veneration of icons. Now imagine standing inside a church you have prayed in all your life. Somewhere in the empire, a few years after that council, the walls you remember from childhood, crowded with the faces of the saints, are gone. In their place, fresh plaster, a plain cross, perhaps a decorative garden scene, the kind of art no one could accuse of being worshipped. Whether you feel relief or grief in that room depends on which side of the argument owns your heart. Entire families, entire monasteries, entire provinces felt it differently. That is what made this conflict so bitter. Both sides were sure they were rescuing the soul of the other. The fiercest resistance came from the monasteries. Monks were the great producers and defenders of icons, and the confrontation turned brutal. The sources describe monks humiliated in the hippodrome, imprisoned, mutilated, and in some cases killed, with one abbot, Stephen the Younger, becoming the era's most famous martyr. Because the record was written by the winners, historians treat the most lurid details cautiously. But no serious scholar doubts that this was persecution, and that it was ugly. For our larger story, one more thing matters enormously. Iconoclasm drove a wedge between Constantinople and the West. The popes in Rome rejected the policy outright and never enforced it. Relations soured decade by decade. And in the year 800, something happened that Constantinople regarded as almost unthinkable insolence. The Pope crowned the Frankish king Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. From the Bosphorus, this looked like a barbarian chieftain stealing the most sacred title on earth, with the blessing of a renegade bishop. From the west, it looked like the birth of a new Europe. Either way, the single Roman world was now two worlds, drifting apart. File that away. In our chapter on 1054, the drift becomes a break, and in 1204, the break becomes a catastrophe. The most fascinating part of the iconoclasm story is how it ended. Twice, the war against images was stopped by a woman. The first was the Empress Irene, widow of an iconoclast emperor, ruling for her young son. In 787, she convened a great church council at Nicaea, which restored the veneration of icons and carefully defined the theology. Honor shown to an image, the council declared, passes to the person it represents. You venerate through the icon, never the object itself. That distinction, hammered out in the fires of this conflict, remains the official doctrine of the Orthodox and Catholic churches to this day. Irene herself is one of the most astonishing and chilling figures in the empire's history. When her son came of age and turned against her policies, she had him deposed and blinded, a mutilation from which, by most accounts, he died. She then ruled alone, the first woman to rule the Roman Empire in her own name. The gold coins she struck carry her image on both sides. An empire that had once been Augustus and the legions was now, for a moment, governed by a woman who had destroyed her own son for power. Contemporaries were as stunned as you are. The peace did not hold. A new round of military disasters convinced a new generation of soldiers that God was angry again. And, in 815, iconoclasm returned for a second act, somewhat less bloody than the first, but real. And from this second act comes one small human story worth carrying with you. Among the defenders of icons in these years was a young noblewoman of Constantinople named Cassia. Later tradition says she was once presented to an emperor as a possible bride and talked herself out of a crown with one sharp theological retort, a story historians enjoy but cannot verify. What is not in doubt is what she became. She founded a monastery, took the veil, and wrote hymns. And she is one of the very few women of the entire Middle Ages whose music still lives. One of her compositions is sung in Orthodox churches every year during Holy Week. 12 centuries after a woman in an empire at war over images sat down and wrote it. Empire, argue. Art outlasts the argument. It took another empress, Theodora, ruling for her young son, to end the war for good. In 843, a church council restored the icons permanently, an event the Orthodox Church still celebrates every year, on the first Sunday of Lent, as the triumph of orthodoxy. Walk into a Greek or Russian church on that Sunday, and you are attending the anniversary of the moment this conflict ended. So, what did the war against images actually decide? Within the empire, almost everything. The settled answer to what religious art is for unleashed a flood of mosaics, icon, and illuminated manuscripts in the style that still defines sacred art for hundreds of millions of Orthodox believers. When you picture a golden mosaic of Christ, you are picturing the art of post-iconoclasm, Constantinople. The victory of the icons was so complete that the world forgot there had ever been a war, which may be the strangest ending any war has ever had. Chapter 7. The Golden Age. Every empire, if it lasts long enough, gets 1 century when everything works. The armies win. The treasury fills. The culture radiates. For the Empire of Constantinople, that century began in 867 with a murder in the palace. The murderer's name was Basil, and his rise is so improbable that if a screenwriter invented it, you would not believe it. He was born into a peasant family in the Balkan lands, a family whose origins Armenian or Slavic, or a blend of both, historians still debate, and which by some accounts had spent time in captivity among the Bulgars. He came to Constantinople as a young man with nothing but exceptional physical strength and ambition to match. He worked as a groom, in charge of horses. Then the Emperor Michael III noticed him, promoted him, and made him a companion and eventually co-emperor. In 867, Basil repaid the favor by having Michael assassinated in his bedchamber and took the throne for himself. It is one of the ugliest ascents in the empire's history, and it founded the most successful dynasty the empire ever had. For roughly 2 centuries, the house that historians call the Macedonian dynasty presided over the recovery, expansion, and cultural explosion that scholars refer to as the Golden Age of Byzantium. A murderer's family gave the Roman world its finest hour since the Caesars. History does not grade on character. What did the Golden Age actually look like? Start with the map. For the first time in centuries, the empire attacked. Soldier emperors and brilliant generals pushed the frontiers outward decade after decade. Crete was retaken in 961, ending an era of Arab piracy in the Aegean. Antioch, one of the great cities of the ancient Christian world, returned to imperial control in 969. The eastern frontier rolled forward into lands lost 3 centuries earlier. The empire of the year 1000 was, by most measures that matter, the strongest power in the Mediterranean world. And everyone around it behaved accordingly. Then look at the city itself. Constantinople in this era was, by the general consensus of historians, the largest and richest city in Christendom, with a population that modern estimates place in the hundreds of thousands at a time when Paris and London were muddy towns of a few tens of thousands. Visitors from Western Europe wrote about it the way people once wrote about arriving in Manhattan. The 10th century Italian diplomat, Liutprand of Cremona, described the imperial palace with its famous mechanical marvels. A golden tree with singing mechanical birds. Golden lions beside the throne that roared and beat the ground with their tails. And a throne that rose toward the ceiling while the visitor lay prostrate. The point of the machines was the message. You are dealing with a civilization operating on a level you cannot match. And there is a small sequel that makes Liutprand human. He came back on a second mission 20 years later, was treated badly, and wrote a furious report home, complaining about everything. The protocol, the lodgings, even the wine, which he claimed was undrinkable. Reading the 2 reports side by side, awe and wounded pride, you get the full range of how the West felt about this city. It never stopped being both, and the Golden Age was not only swords and gold, it was books. This era saw a great revival of classical learning, with copying rooms across the empire, and above all, in the capital, preserving and studying the literature of ancient Greece. State this one carefully, because it is one of the empire's greatest gifts, and it deserves accuracy rather than hype. A substantial share of the ancient Greek literature that survives today, including works of Homer, Plato, Sophocles, and Thucydides, reached the modern world through the manuscripts copied by Byzantine scribes and schools. They were not the only road. Arabic translators in Baghdad preserved and extended Greek science and philosophy. Latin monasteries in the West kept their own flame, and much of ancient literature was lost everywhere, despite everyone. But when Italian scholars of the Renaissance went hunting for the Greek classics, the manuscripts they found, and the teachers who could read them, came overwhelmingly out of the Byzantine world. The books this empire copied in its golden age are part of the foundation the modern library was built on. Now for the part of the golden age that redrew the map of the world we live in right now. North of the empire, across the Black Sea, lay the vast world of the Slavs. and among them a rising power centered on Kiev, ruled by princes of Viking descent, known as the Rus. The relationship started violently, more than once in the 9th and 10th centuries. Rus fleets appeared out of the north and attacked Constantinople itself. The empire answered with the tools it knew best: Greek fire at sea and diplomacy on land. And its most powerful diplomatic weapon was not gold. It was faith. In the 860s, Constantinople had sent 2 brother missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, to the Slavic lands. To translate scripture, Cyril devised a script for the Slavic tongue, the alphabet scholars call Glagolitic. His disciples, driven out of Central Europe after his death, carried the mission into Bulgaria. And there, in the following generation, a simpler script took shape, built largely on Greek letters, adapted for Slavic sounds. That later alphabet is the one that received Cyril's name and conquered the region, the Cyrillic alphabet. If you have ever seen Russian or Ukrainian or Bulgarian writing, you are looking at the long legacy of a mission that set out from this city 11.5 centuries ago. The decisive moment came in the 980s. The Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, was choosing an official religion for his realm, and the famous account in the Rus chronicles describes his envoys reporting back on the faiths of the world. When they described attending services in Hagia Sophia, the chronicle gives them one of the most quoted lines of the Middle Ages, that they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth. The story, as told, is legend polished for effect, and historians say so. The outcome is hard fact. Around 988, Vladimir accepted baptism from Constantinople, married the emperor's own sister, a marriage into the imperial family of a rank almost never granted to outsiders, and led his people into Orthodox Christianity. Measure the consequences of that one transaction. Kiev and its successor states entered the civilizational orbit of Constantinople, not Rome. Faith, alphabet, art, political imagination, all of it flowed north from the Bosphorus. Centuries later, after this story ends, Moscow would even style itself a third Rome, heir of Constantinople. When you read about the politics of Eastern Europe in your own lifetime, you are reading, in part, the long echo of a baptism in 988. And there is one more thread from that bargain. Part of the deal involved Vladimir sending the emperor thousands of Viking warriors. These men became the Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the emperors. And for generations it was staffed by Norsemen and later Englishmen who travelled across the known world to serve the ruler they called the Great King in Miklagard. Their name for Constantinople, the Great City. Real Norse sagas name real men who served here. One of them, Harald Hardrada, banked a fortune in imperial service, went home, became king of Norway, and died invading England in 1066, weeks before the Battle of Hastings. And in the marble of Hagia Sophia's upper gallery, you can still see, scratched into the railing, a runic inscription, Viking graffiti, likely carved by a bored guardsman during a long service 1,000 years ago. Umpires rise and fall. Bored soldiers are eternal. The Golden Age reached its terrifying peak under the Emperor Basil II, great-great-grandson of the founding murderer. Basil ruled for almost half a century, until 1025, and he was a new kind of emperor, unmarried, austerer, uninterested in luxury, married only to the army and the state. His great project was the conquest of Bulgaria, the empire's most dangerous Balkan rival, and he pursued it with a patience and ruthlessness that made him a legend. Later, chronicles gave him a nickname that survives to this day, the Bulgar Slayer, and attached to it a story of mass blinding, of prisoners so extreme that modern historians debate how literally to take it. What is certain is that after decades of grinding war, Bulgaria was annexed outright, and the empire's frontier stood on the Danube for the first time in 4 centuries. When Basil died in 1025, the empire of Constantinople stretched from southern Italy to the borders of Armenia, from the Danube to Syria. Its treasury was full to overflowing. Its enemies were broken or bound as clients. Its church had converted the largest nation of the future. Its scribes guarded the learning of the ancients. Stand on the walls in 1025, and it was reasonable to believe the empire was eternal. It was 1 generation from disaster. Basil II never married and left no son, and the empire he left behind had a flaw at its heart. A flaw as old as Augustus. It had never solved the problem of succession. What followed his death was a parade of court intrigues, elderly heiresses, and ambitious mediocrities, while the army that had built the Golden Age was starved and sidelined. Because strong armies frighten nervous courts. The empire at its peak had roughly 50 years left before the wound that would never fully heal. How the strongest state in the Mediterranean world threw away its own Golden Age runs through a broken marriage between 2 churches, and a single catastrophic afternoon on a plain called Manzikert. Chapter 8. The Cracks. Empires rarely die of a single wound. They die of cracks. Small ones at first, ignored because the walls still look strong. In the 50 years after Basil II, the empire of Constantinople developed 3 cracks at once. 1 in its church, 1 in its army, 1 in its judgment about who its friends were. By the end of this chapter, the Golden Age will be a memory. Start with the church, because that crack had been widening for 2 centuries. You have watched the drift happen. Iconoclasm poisoned relations with the popes. The crowning of Charlemagne in 800 created a rival Roman Empire in the West, and underneath the politics ran deeper differences. The West prayed in Latin, the East in Greek, and by this era, almost nobody on either side could read the other's language. The 2 halves of Christendom had spent centuries becoming strangers, and strangers assume the worst about each other. The theological disputes sound almost absurdly small to modern ears. The most famous concerned a single Latin word, filioque, meaning and the Son, which the West had added to the ancient creed describing the Holy Spirit. There were quarrels over whether communion bread should be leavened or unleavened, over fasting rules, over whether priests could marry. But listen past the details, and you hear the real argument. Who has the final word in Christendom? The Pope in Rome claimed authority over the whole church. Constantinople answered that the church was governed by councils and by the ancient patriarchates together, and that no single bishop, however honored, ruled the rest. That argument was not small at all. It is arguably still unresolved 1,000 years later. In 1054, it detonated. A papal delegation led by Cardinal Humbert arrived in Constantinople to negotiate, and found in the Patriarch Michael Kerularios a man exactly as proud and stubborn as Humbert himself. The negotiation collapsed into insult. On July 16th, 1054, Humbert marched into Hagia Sophia during the hour of worship and slammed a document of excommunication down on the main altar, condemning the Patriarch. The Patriarch answered by excommunicating the delegation right back. Now the strange truth about that famous scene, almost nobody at the time thought it was final. Excommunications between quarreling churchmen had happened before and been patched up. The technical legality of Humbert's document was dubious, since the Pope who sent him had actually died weeks earlier. Scholars of the period, like the historian Stephen Runciman in his classic study of the Schism, stress that the true and permanent break came later, hardened by the events of our next chapter. But 1054 became the symbolic date, the visible crack. Christendom now had two halves that had formerly cursed each other. Remember that when the West's armored pilgrims start arriving at the gates, the second crack was the army. The great soldier emperors of the Golden Age had built their power on a professional core army and on a system of frontier soldiers bound to the land they defended. What happened to that machine in the 11th century is still debated by historians, and the honest picture is messier than a single villain. Successive governments reduced, reorganized, or neglected parts of the military system. Budgets tightened. Some veteran units were disbanded. Some frontier arrangements lapsed. And gaps were increasingly filled with foreign mercenaries who fought for pay rather than home. And through it all ran a political instinct as old as the empire. Courts fear popular generals, because popular generals have a habit of marching on capitals. Whatever the exact weights of neglect, reform, and fear, the result is not in dispute. Within a generation or two, the finest military machine in the Mediterranean world had lost much of its edge. At the precise moment, history demanded the opposite, because the enemy had changed. Out of Central Asia, a new power had swept into the Islamic world. The Seljuk Turks, nomadic horse archers recently converted to Islam, hard riding, fast, and expanding. By the 1060s, Turkish raiders were cutting deep into Anatolia, the empire's heartland, the great peninsula that is modern Turkey, from which the army drew many of its best recruits and the treasury drew its taxes. The court in Constantinople treated the raids as a nuisance. They were the future arriving. In 1068, Alarm finally produced an emperor from the military class, Romanos, the fourth Diogenes, a brave and reasonably capable general who inherited a weakened instrument. He rebuilt what he could and, in 1071, marched east with a large army to push the Turks back once and for all. Near a fortress town called Manzikert, north of Lake Van, he met the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. Stand with Romanos for a moment on the evening of that battle, because his story is the empire's story in a single afternoon. He has fought all day. The Turks, masters of the feigned retreat, have drawn his lines out across the plain and worn them thin. As the light fails, he orders the army to turn back toward camp. And that ordinary command becomes a catastrophe, because behind him rides a man who wants him to lose, Andronikos Doukas, a member of the powerful family that hates the emperor, commands the rear guard, and instead of covering the withdrawal, he spreads the word that the emperor is dead and marches his troops off the field. The line, told its emperor has fallen, believes it, and breaks. Romanos fights on with what is left, is wounded, and is captured. For the first time in the empire's entire history, a reigning Roman emperor is a prisoner of a Muslim ruler. The eyewitness historian Michael Attaliates, who was with the army, records the disaster with the grief of a man watching a world end. Then came one of history's strange gestures. Alp Arslan treated his captive with courtesy, negotiated a surprisingly moderate ransom and treaty, and let him go. The Sultan's terms would have cost the empire some fortresses and money. Not Anatolia. Manzikert, as a battle, was a defeat, but not an annihilation. What turned it into a catastrophe was Constantinople. While Romanos was a captive, the court declared him deposed. When he returned to reclaim his throne, his rivals fought him, defeated him, and, despite promises of safety, blinded him so brutally that he died of the wounds in 1072. And then, with the emperor question settled, The factions of the capital spent the next decade fighting each other for the throne, while the eastern frontier stood unmanned. Rival claimants even hired Turkish war bands and invited them across Anatolia to fight their civil wars for them, handing the newcomers roads, fortresses, and paychecks. The result was the empire's deepest wound. In the 10 years after Manzikert, Turkish power spread across almost the whole Anatolian plateau. Not mainly by conquest, but by moving into a vacuum the Romans had created themselves. The empire lost its recruiting ground, its tax base, and its strategic depth, most of it never to return. Modern historians disagree about many things concerning this era, but on one point they are nearly unanimous. The battle itself was survivable. The civil wars afterward were not. In 1081, out of that chaos, a capable soldier and subtle diplomat named Alexios Komnenos seized the throne, and his dynasty, the Komnenoi, would spend the next century staging a remarkable partial recovery. His daughter Anna Komnene would write the Alexiad, a history of her father's reign and one of the great books of the Middle Ages, written by one of its great female minds. It is through her eyes that we see the third crack open. Alexios needed soldiers. The West had them, whole societies of armored knights. So in 1095 he sent envoys to the Pope asking for mercenary help against the Turks. What he wanted was a few thousand professionals under his command. What he got, after Pope Urban II preached holy war at Clermont, was the First Crusade. Tens of thousands of armed pilgrims, princes, knights, and peasants, marching toward Constantinople with their own leaders, their own ambitions, and a burning goal of their own: Jerusalem. Anna Komnene describes the Crusader armies arriving before the city with a mixture of awe and dread, and her assessment was that her father stood before them like a man managing a force of nature. Alexios handled it with cold skill, ferrying the armies across the strait, extracting oaths that reconquered imperial lands would be returned, and feeding them toward Asia. The alliance produced real victories, including the recovery of Nicaea and the western coastlands. It also produced, at Antioch, the first great betrayal, when the Crusader Bohemond kept the reconquered city for himself in 1098, oaths notwithstanding, and it planted a poison that grew for 100 years. To the Latin West, the Greeks were schismatic schemers who taxed and manipulated honest warriors of Christ. To the Romans of Constantinople, the Latins were violent barbarians who could not be trusted near anything valuable. Every crusade that passed the city deepened both convictions. Meanwhile, Italian merchant republics, above all Venice, extracted sweeping trade privileges inside the empire, until much of Constantinople's own commerce ran through foreign hands, and resentment in the streets grew murderous. In 1182, a mob in Constantinople turned on the city's Latin residents and massacred them. How many died is unknowable, and the figures in medieval accounts are not accepted literally by modern historians. But the killing was real, indiscriminate, and remembered. The West did not forget. Picture the empire around 1180. Then, as a visitor would have seen it, golden mosaics rising, a court that dazzled, an army that had won back the coasts, a capital still without rival in Christendom, and running through all of it, invisible from the harbour, 3 cracks, a church formerly estranged from half of Christendom, a heartland lost to the Turks, and a relationship with the armed West compounded of dependence, contempt, and hatred, growing worse with every decade. All that was needed now was for the empire's own politics to fail one more time, and for a crusade to arrive at the gates at exactly the wrong moment, led by exactly the wrong men, owing money to exactly the wrong city. In 1201, that crusade began gathering in Venice. Chapter 9, 1204. Betrayed by the cross. Ask people to name the army that first conquered Constantinople, and nearly everyone reaches for the Ottomans and 1453. The true first answer is stranger and darker. The first army to breach the great city, sack it, and burn its heart out was an army of Christian crusaders, wearing the cross, blessed for a war against Islam, who never fought that war. This is the story of the Fourth Crusade, and if it is new to you, prepare yourself. It does not get better as it goes. It began, as disasters often do, with a contract that could not be paid. In the year 1201, the leaders of a new crusade signed an agreement with the Republic of Venice. Venice would build a fleet to carry more than 30,000 men to attack Egypt, the center of Muslim power. In exchange for a colossal sum of silver, Venice held up its end, suspending much of its economy for a year to build the ships. The crusade did not. When the army assembled in 1202, barely a third of the expected numbers arrived, and the money fell catastrophically short. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, now enters our story, and few figures in it are more extraordinary or more debated. He was in his 90s, and he was blind, and he was one of the sharpest statesmen in Europe, facing crusaders who could not pay. Dandolo offered a deferral with a price. First, the fleet would stop at Zara, a rebellious Christian city on the Adriatic coast that Venice wanted back. The crusade to fight Islam opened its campaign by besieging and sacking a Catholic city in 1202, for which the Pope, Innocent III, excommunicated the entire expedition. The Crusade of the Cross was now, technically, cut off from the church. It kept going anyway. Then came the offer that redirected history. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, reached the Crusader camp. His father, the Emperor Isaac Angelos, had been deposed and blinded by his own brother in a palace coup, and the young man made the fateful pitch: "Restore my father and me to the throne, and I will pay you 200,000 silver marks. Supply the crusade, add 10,000 soldiers to it, and place the Church of Constantinople under Rome. Every debt solved, every ambition served. All it required was a brief stop at the richest city in the Christian world." The chroniclers, traveling with the army, men like Geoffrey of Villehardouin, whose eyewitness account survives, record the debates. Many crusaders refused and abandoned the expedition in disgust. The leadership accepted. In June of 1203, the fleet dropped anchor before Constantinople, and Villehardouin describes men crowding the decks in genuine awe, writing that those who had never seen the city could not believe so rich a place could exist in all the world. Understand clearly what the city was in 1203, because you are seeing it for the last time. Constantinople was the unlooted museum of the ancient world. For nearly 900 years, while Rome burned and the West struggled, treasures had accumulated here. Bronze statues by the masters of classical Greece, the relics of Christendom beyond counting, the libraries, the treasuries. No foreign army had ever gotten inside. Everything was still there. The first act went roughly as the prince promised. The crusaders assaulted the sea walls. The usurper fled, and Isaac and young Alexios were installed as co-emperors in August 1203. Then the bill came due, and the new emperor discovered what everyone in the city already knew. The treasury was empty, wrecked by decades of misrule. To pay, he stripped churches and melted sacred objects. which made his own people despise him as a Latin puppet, while the payments still fell short, which made the Crusaders despise him as a liar. Riots and fires tore the city, including a catastrophic blaze, by the account of Villehardouin himself, started by Latin looters, that burned out a vast swath of homes. By January 1204, the young emperor was deposed and strangled by a Byzantine rival who took the throne as Alexios V and refused to pay another coin. Now the crusade stood before the walls, unpaid, excommunicated, winter-worn, and furious, and its leaders made the decision that stains them forever. If the Greeks would not pay the debt, the city itself would be the payment. In March 1204, the Crusader and Venetian leadership signed a treaty dividing the empire of Constantinople among themselves before they had conquered it. Clergy with the army assured the rank and file that the Greeks were schismatics, traitors to the crusade, and that this war was righteous. On April 12, 1204, the assault came from the harbour. Ships lashed together against the sea walls of the Golden Horn. The defence broke. That night, fire again, a third great fire, ripped through the city, and on to April 13th, resistance collapsed, and the army was let loose. What followed was 3 days of sack, and our knowledge of it comes from both sides, from Villehardouin and other Crusader chroniclers, and above all, from Nicetas Choniets, a senior Byzantine official and historian who lived through it, lost everything, and wrote the fullest account. He describes the systematic stripping of palaces and churches. He describes drunken soldiers in Hagia Sophia tearing apart the great altar, loading mules with treasure inside the church itself. And, in the detail that shocked Christendom for centuries, a prostitute seated on the patriarch's throne, singing, while the sack went on around her. He describes citizens robbed, women violated, tombs of the emperors broken open, including, by the accounts of the period, the tomb of Justinian himself. Choniats is a partisan witness with every reason for bitterness, and historians read individual details with care. But the scale of the catastrophe is not in dispute from any side. Even Innocent III, when reports reached him, wrote in fury that the Crusaders had turned their swords on fellow Christians, and that the Greek Church could hardly be expected to embrace Rome after seeing the Latins. In his phrase, working works of darkness, and beyond the gold, something else was lost that no ransom could ever buy back. Memory. Ancient bronzes that had survived from classical Greece were melted for coin. Choniats wrote a separate lament cataloguing the destroyed statues. The colossal Hera, the Hercules attributed to the school of the great sculptor Lysippos, melted by men he called barbarians who could not read. Libraries burned in the fires or were scattered. And scholars believe some ancient texts that had survived to 1204 in the city's collections vanished in these days. Works we know today only by their titles. The Venetians, more discerning, stole rather than melted. The 4 gilded bronze horses that stood in the hippodrome were shipped to Venice and mounted in triumph on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. They stand in Venice still. The originals are preserved inside the Basilica's museum today, safe from the weather, while replicas look down from the facade where the trophies once stood. Tourists photograph them every hour. Very few know they are loot from one of the greatest robberies of the Middle Ages. The Crusaders then did what their treaty promised. They carved up the empire, crowned a Latin emperor in Hagia Sophia, and installed a Latin patriarch. The crusade that had set out to strike Egypt for the liberation of Jerusalem never went to Egypt and never threatened Jerusalem. It broke instead the strongest Christian state of its world. the state that had guarded Europe's eastern flank for centuries. Weigh the consequences, because this is the hinge of the entire second half of our story. The schism of 1054, which churchmen might have healed, was now sealed in blood and humiliation. And the memory of 1204 poisons relations between Rome and Orthodoxy into living memory. In 2004, 8 centuries later, the Pope of Rome formally expressed sorrow for the sack. And strategically, the wound never closed. A Latin regime sat in the capital for 57 years, ruling a shrinking rump, while Greek successor states fought to reclaim the inheritance. The empire that eventually returned would be a shadow, holding walls built for a superpower with the resources of a province. Far to the east, in the hills of Anatolia, among the Turkish principalities of the frontier, the future was already stirring. Within 2 generations of the sack, a small war band would gather around a chief whose name the world would come to know very well. Osman. His descendants would be called Ottomans. The city of Constantine had been betrayed by the cross. What was left of it now had to learn how to be an empire in exile. Chapter 10. Exile and the Long Twilight. What happens to an empire when its capital is stolen? For the Romans of Constantinople, the answer was strange and stubborn. The empire refused to admit it was dead. It packed up its identity and moved. After the sack of 1204, the Roman world shattered into fragments, and 3 Greek successor states each claimed to be the true continuation of the empire. The most important of them formed just across the water from the lost capital. In the city of Nicaea, there, an emperor in exile was crowned, a patriarch in exile was installed, and a government in exile began doing something remarkable. It governed well. Freed from the crushing weight of the capital's court politics, the emperors of Nicaea built a compact, solvent, disciplined state. They fielded real armies. They balanced budgets. Refugee scholars gathered at their court and kept the flame of Greek learning burning. Nicaea became a small model of what the empire might have been all along, if it had not been so rich. Meanwhile, inside Constantinople, the Latin Empire installed by the Crusaders was failing spectacularly. The conquerors had seized a wonder of the world and could not afford to run it. Their regime was land poor, cash poor, and surrounded by enemies. Its emperors became so desperate for money that they began selling the city's most sacred treasures. The relic venerated as the crown of thorns was pawned to Venetian creditors and ultimately purchased by King Louis IX of France, who built the glittering Sainte-Chapelle in Paris to house it. By the 1250s, by the accounts of the period, Latin soldiers were stripping lead from palace roofs to sell, and burning the beams of great buildings for firewood. The thieves were now looting their own stolen house to stay alive. The end came almost as an accident. In July of 1261, a Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos was passing near the city with a small advance force when local farmers told him the Latin garrison and the Venetian fleet were away on a raid. On the night of July 25th, his men entered through a lightly guarded point, by one tradition through a hidden passage, and opened a gate from inside. The Latin emperor fled so quickly he left his regalia behind. 57 years of occupation ended in a single night, with barely a battle, because the occupation had rotted from within. 3 weeks later, the Nicaean emperor, Michael Palaiologos, entered Constantinople in solemn procession behind an icon of the Virgin. Through the Golden Gate, the ancient triumphal entrance of the emperors, the people wept in the streets. The empire was home, but the homecoming revealed a wreck. Whole districts still lay in ashes from the fires of 1203 and 1204, never rebuilt. Palaces stood roofless. The population had collapsed to a fraction of its former size. The city, built for hundreds of thousands, now held, by modern scholarly estimates, only tens of thousands, scattered in inhabited islands, among ruins and market gardens. Michael restored what he could. But the truth was structural and permanent. The empire had recovered its capital without recovering its strength. It was now a middling regional state, wearing the crown of a superpower, defending the largest fortifications in the world with the tax base of a province. The 2 centuries that followed, the Paleologan Twilight, played out that contradiction to its bitter end. First, the empire's rivals multiplied while its resources shrank. To pay for fleets and armies it no longer had, the emperors mortgaged their economy to Venice and Genoa, whose merchant colonies came to dominate the empire's own trade. The Genoese quarter of Galata, directly across the Golden Horn from the city, grew so rich that by the mid-1300s its customs revenues, by the bitter testimony of Byzantine writers themselves, dwarfed those of Constantinople proper. The empire had become a spectator to the commerce of its own harbour. Second, the dynasty turned on itself with suicidal regularity. Twice in the 1300s, disputed successions exploded into full civil wars. Grandfather against grandson, regents against heirs, and the warring factions did what desperate factions had done since Manzikert. They hired their enemies, Serbian armies, and increasingly Turkish armies, were invited into the Balkans to fight Roman civil wars, were paid in plunder and territory, and learned every road. And in the middle of the Second Great Civil War came the hammer blow no one could have planned for. In 1347, the Black Death arrived, entering Europe in part through the Black Sea trade routes that ran past the city's own walls. The Emperor John Cantacuzene, who ruled through those years and later wrote his own history of them, lost his youngest son to the plague. The city, already hollowed, was hollowed again. And third, while the Romans bled themselves, the small Ottoman warband we left in the hills of Anatolia grew with astonishing speed. Osman's frontier principality captured the great city of Bursa in 1326 and made it a capital. In 1354, an earthquake threw down the walls of Gallipoli, on the European side of the strait, separating Europe from Asia, and the Ottomans, who were in the region precisely because a Byzantine faction had hired them, occupied the ruins and stayed. It was the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe, acquired without a battle, and it changed everything. Within a generation, Ottoman armies took Adrianople, the second city of the Byzantine Balkans, and made it their new capital. Edirne. The geography tells the whole story. The Ottoman capital was now northwest of Constantinople. The city of Constantine was no longer the frontier of Christendom facing Asia. It was an island, entirely surrounded by Ottoman territory, a Roman rock in a Turkish sea. The Balkans fell next, kingdom by kingdom. In 1389, at Kosovo, the Ottomans broke Serbian power in a battle that lives in Balkan memory to this day. In 1396, a great Western crusade finally marched to stop them, and was annihilated at Nicopolis on the Danube. The Sultan Bayezid, called the Thunderbolt, then turned to the obvious final prize and blockaded Constantinople itself for years, building a fortress on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus to strangle the city's grain supply. By the year 1400, the Emperor Manuel II was doing something no Roman emperor had ever done. He was touring the courts of Western Europe, London and Paris, personally, as a supplicant, asking for rescue. English and French chroniclers describe the dignified Greek emperor at their feasts, and the pity his situation aroused. Pity sent almost no soldiers. Then, in 1402, the city was saved by a collision it had no hand in. Out of Central Asia came Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, one of the most feared conquerors in world history. At Ankara, in the heart of Anatolia, Timur's army destroyed the Ottoman host and captured the Sultan Bayezid himself, who died in captivity. The Ottoman state collapsed into a decade of civil war among Bayezid's sons. The blockade of Constantinople simply evaporated. The city had been handed by an Asian conqueror who cared nothing for it. One final gift. 50 years of borrowed time. The tragedy of that reprieve is plain to state. The empire could not use it. It was too small, too poor, too surrounded to rebuild real power. Whatever its rulers did, the Ottomans reunified within a generation and resumed their expansion as if Ankara had never happened. The emperors played the only card left, the desperate hope of Western rescue, and paid its terrible price. At the Council of Florence, in 1439, the Emperor John VIII and his delegation formally accepted union with the Roman Church, essentially conceding the ancient argument, in exchange for the promise of a crusade. The crusade came in 1444 and was destroyed at Varna. And at home, the union tore the Roman people themselves apart. Many clergy and much of the population rejected it as a betrayal of orthodoxy purchased at the moment of weakness. Remembering, always, what Latin rescue had looked like in 1204, a saying circulated in the city in those final years, recorded in various forms by writers of the period, that some Romans would rather see the Sultan's turban in Constantinople than a cardinal's hat. It was despair speaking, but despair with a long memory. Yet, even now, in the deepest twilight, the city was still giving gifts to the future. In 1397, a Byzantine diplomat and scholar named Manuel Chrysoloras arrived in Florence, invited to teach something no one in Italy had mastered for centuries: Greek. His lectures, by the accounts of his Italian students, set off a scholarly gold rush. As a generation of humanists learned to read Homer and Plato in the original and began hunting for manuscripts across the Greek world, the Renaissance was made of many streams: Italian wealth, Latin learning, new arts, and it belonged to no single source. But one of its streams flowed straight from this dying city, carried by teachers and refugees and crates of books, as if the empire, sensing the end, had begun mailing its library to posterity. Picture the city in 1450. Then, the population, by modern estimates, perhaps 50,000, living amid ruins and orchards inside walls built for 10 times that number. The empire consists of the city, its suburbs, and a province in southern Greece. The emperor is a palaiologos, ruling from a crumbling palace, crowned in debt, defended by the greatest fortifications on earth and almost nothing else. And still, on quiet mornings, the scribes are copying Plato, and the city still calls itself Rome, a candle burned down to the last inch of wax, still lit. In 1451, in the Ottoman capital of Edirne, a new sultan came to the throne. The ambassadors of Europe reported home, with relief, that he was a mild and inexperienced boy of 19 who wanted peace. They were about to make the last great mistake in Roman history. His name was Mehmed, and he had wanted one thing since childhood. Chapter 11. The Boy Sultan and the Great Canon. History sometimes produces a collision of two people so perfectly matched that it feels scripted. In 1451, the throne of the Ottoman Empire and the throne of the Roman Empire were held by two men who might have respected each other deeply in another life. One had everything except the city. The other had nothing except the city. Their names were Mehmed II and Constantine the 11th. And this chapter belongs to them. Start with the Sultan, because the ambassadors who called him a harmless boy were misreading one of the most formidable minds of the century. Mehmed was 19 when his father died, but he had already technically reigned once. As a child, during his father's brief retirement, an episode so turbulent that the old Sultan had to come back. The humiliation of that first reign burned in him. The Greek historian Critouvolos, who later entered Mehmed's service and wrote a history of his conquests, portrays a ruler of ferocious intelligence, fluent in several languages, steeped in history, and given to comparing himself to Alexander. Court historians flatter, and Critouvolos wrote for his master. So historians balance his portrait against Ottoman and Western sources. The balance still comes out formidable: immense ability, immense ambition, and a self-control that could be unnerving. Within months of his accession, Mehmed had signed friendly treaties in every direction, lulling Venice, Hungary, and the Byzantines themselves. He wanted no distractions. He was clearing his desk for one project. Why did the city matter so much, when the lands around it were already Ottoman on every side? 3 reasons, and they explain the entire war. Strategically, Constantinople sat in the middle of Ottoman territory like a foreign gate in a man's own house, controlling the crossing between the empire's Asian and European halves, always available as a landing point for a Western crusade. Economically, it commanded the Bosphorus and the Black Sea trade, and, symbolically, it was the prize of prizes. For 8 centuries, Islamic tradition had honored the city as a destined conquest, and armies had broken against its walls. As we saw earlier in our journey, the ruler who took it would step into the succession of the Caesars and the prophecies at once. A 19-year-old who compared himself to Alexander did not intend to leave that to someone else. Now the emperor, Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, was 43 when he inherited the throne early in 1449, and almost everything about his reign was already impossible. He had been an energetic and brave governor in southern Greece, and contemporaries, including his friend and secretary George Francis, whose memoirs are one of our key sources, portray a man of duty rather than brilliance, personally courageous, honest by the standards of his dynasty, and fully aware of what was coming. He ruled a city of ruins with an empty treasury. He upheld the hated church union because Western help was the only card in his hand, and his own people distrusted him for it. There are worse fates than commanding a lost cause, but not many, and Constantine seems to have understood his position with clear eyes from the beginning. The first open move came in 1452, and it was not a battle. It was a construction project. On the European shore of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point of the strait, a few miles north of Constantinople, Mehmed personally directed thousands of workers in building a fortress. Ottoman sources and Greek sources together describe a project of stunning speed. Walls and great towers rising in roughly 4.5 months. The Turks came to call it Rumeli Hisari, the fortress of Europe. Its purpose required no explanation. Directly across the water stood an older Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore. Together, their cannons closed the Bosphorus. No grain ship from the Black Sea could reach Constantinople without Ottoman permission. The Greeks, with grim clarity, called the new castle the Throat Cutter. When a Venetian ship tried to run the blockade that November, it was sunk by the fortress guns, and its captain was executed. The message was received in every court in Europe. The siege had effectively begun before a single soldier stood before the walls. Constantine sent embassies protesting. then embassies offering tribute, then embassies begging. Mehmed's answers hardened until they became a simple demand: surrender the city and receive compensation elsewhere. Constantine's final answer, as the Greek sources record it, was that surrendering the city was not his to do, that it was not his possession but a trust, and that all within it would die of their own free will before giving it up. Whatever polish later writers added to the words, his actions matched them exactly. And then there is the canon, and the story of the canon deserves a moment of silence from every student of history, because it may be the most costly missed opportunity in the entire 1,000 years of this series. There was a master canon founder, a Christian engineer from Hungary or Transylvania, named Orban, in 1452, by the account of the Greek historian Ducas, one of our principal sources for these years. Orban came first to Constantinople and offered his services to the emperor. Constantine could not pay him. The empire that had once guarded the secret of Greek fire, the wonder weapon of the 700s, could not afford the salary of one gunsmith. Orban went to Edirne, to Mehmed, who reportedly asked him a single question: whether he could cast a gun to bring down the walls of Constantinople. Orban answered, by Ducas's telling, that he could build a cannon to shatter the very gates of Babylon. Mehmed gave him everything he asked, several times his asking wage, and unlimited material. What Orban built in the following months, and what eyewitnesses of the siege later described, was the largest gun anyone in that world had ever seen. The accounts, Greek, Italian, and Ottoman, differ in exact measurements, as medieval accounts always do. But they agree on the essentials: a bronze monster, roughly 26 to 27 feet long, firing a stone ball weighing over 1,000 pounds, whose blast, witnesses claimed, could be heard for miles. It was cast in Edirne, test fired there to the terror of the countryside, and then dragged toward Constantinople by teams reported in the sources as numbering 60 oxen and hundreds of men, moving a few miles a day, with crews leveling roads and reinforcing bridges ahead of it. Hold that image, because the medieval world was ending at 2 miles an hour. For 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls had been the argument nobody could answer. Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, the armies of 2 caliphates, all had broken against that triple line, and the city had outlived them all. The walls were a large part of the reason there was still a Roman Empire. And now, a new technology, gunpowder, artillery, purchased with the one resource the Romans no longer had, money, was crawling up the road from Edirne to test whether the argument still held. Through the winter of 1452 and 53, both sides made their final preparations. Mehmed massed his army in Thrace, and modern historians, weighing the wildly inflated figures in some chronicles against Ottoman records and logistics, generally estimate the besieging force at somewhere between 60 and 80,000 fighting men, supported by a fleet, itself a new and shocking development, of well over 100 vessels. Historians continue to debate the exact numbers, but no one debates the imbalance. Inside the city, Constantine ordered his secretary Francis to conduct a secret census of every man capable of bearing arms. Francis records in his memoirs that the count came to fewer than 5,000 Romans, plus roughly 2,000 foreigners, and that the emperor, upon hearing the total, was struck with grief and ordered it kept secret. 7,000 men, or thereabouts, to hold 14 miles of walls. Help did come, a trickle of it, and history should remember the trickle. The most important arrival came in January 1453. A Genoese soldier of fortune named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who brought 700 professional fighting men at his own initiative and was a renowned expert in exactly the skill the city needed most: the defense of walls. Constantine gave him overall command of the land defenses. Venetian residents of the city voted to stay and fight. A handful of Genoese, Spaniards, and others joined, and one Ottoman prince, Orhan, a rival claimant to Mehmed's own throne, living in Byzantine exile, took his place on the ramparts with his retainers. Across the Golden Horn, the Great Iron Chain, the city's ancient harbour barrier, was hauled taut from the sea walls to the Tower of Galata, closing the inner harbour to the Ottoman fleet. In the first days of April 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before the land walls and spread out across the whole horizon, tent by tent, gun by gun, until it faced the city from sea to sea. On April 6th, the Great Bombardment began. 53 days remained in the Roman Empire. Chapter 12. The 53 Days. We know the siege of Constantinople almost day by day, because the people inside wrote it down. A Venetian ship's doctor named Niccolo Barbaro kept a diary through the entire siege, dating his entries like a logbook. The emperor's secretary Francis survived to write his memoirs. The Archbishop Leonard of Chios wrote his account within weeks of the end. On the other side, Ottoman chroniclers and the Greek historian Critouvulos, writing later in Mehmed's service, recorded the view from the conqueror's camp, put them together, and the last 53 days of the Roman Empire unfold in front of you like scenes from a film. So let's live them. April 6th, 1453. The bombardment opens. Orban's great cannon and dozens of smaller guns begin methodically hammering the Theodosian walls, concentrating on the Lycus Valley section, the lowest and weakest stretch of the line. The great gun is so massive it can fire only a handful of times a day, its barrel cooling for hours between shots, by some accounts soaked with oil to prevent cracking. But when it fires, witnesses write that the ball smashes whole sections of wall that had stood for 1,000 years. Barbaro records the walls crumbling day after day. And then, the defenders answer. And their answer is the quiet miracle of the siege. Every night, under the direction of Giustiniani, soldiers and civilians, men and women together, haul timber, rubble, and barrels of earth into the breaches, building improvised stockades. The sources describe these earthen ramparts absorbing cannon fire better than rigid stone, the balls sinking into soft soil instead of shattering masonry. Each morning, where the Ottomans expect an open breach, a new wall stands. This nightly resurrection continues for the entire siege. The city is bleeding and healing itself in its sleep, over and over, for 7 weeks. April 12th. The Ottoman fleet attacks the harbour chain and is beaten back by the taller Christian ships, whose crews rain missiles down from high decks. April 18th. The first major night assault on the land walls is thrown back after hours of brutal fighting at the stockades. The defence is holding everywhere. April 20th brings the day the whole city dares to hope. 4 ships appear from the south, 3 Genoese transports carrying men and supplies sent by the Pope, and 1 great imperial ship loaded with grain. The entire Ottoman fleet moves to intercept 4 ships, and the city watches the battle from the sea walls. What follows, recorded in detail by Barbaro and the other eyewitnesses, is almost beyond belief. The 4 tall ships, with the wind failing, are surrounded by swarming galleys and fight them off for hours. Hulls locked together, crews hurling stones and firepots from the high decks. Mehmed himself, watching from the shore, is described by the chroniclers as riding his horse into the shallows in fury. screaming orders at his admiral. At dusk, the wind returns. The 4 ships bull their way through the wreckage, and the chain opens to let them into the Golden Horn. The city erupts. The Sultan's navy has been humiliated in front of both armies. By the account of Dukas, the Ottoman admiral is dismissed and beaten, escaping execution only through the pleas of his officers. Mehmed's response to this defeat is the strategic masterstroke of the siege, and one of the most audacious feats in military history. If the chain will not let his fleet into the Golden Horn by sea, he will send it there by land. His engineers build a greased wooden roadway over the ridge behind Galata, more than a mile of slipway, climbing hundreds of feet and descending to the harbour's northern shore. On the morning of April 22nd, the defenders on the sea walls look across the Golden Horn and see the impossible. Ottoman warships, dozens of them, sails set, crews at their stations, are sliding down the hillside on rollers, hauled by oxen and men, and splashing one by one into the harbour behind the chain. Barbaro records the stunned disbelief in the city. The Golden Horn, the city's safe inner sea for 1,000 years, is now a war zone. The defenders, already stretched to nothing, must now man the harbour walls too. An attempt to burn the transported fleet with fireships days later is betrayed or blundered. The sources differ, and the Venetian crews who are captured are executed in view of the walls. The city answers by executing Ottoman prisoners on the ramparts. The siege is turning merciless. May now, and the grinding sets in. The great cannon fires on. The nightly repairs continue. Food runs short inside the city, and Barbaro writes of men leaving the walls to search for bread for their families and being ordered back. Mehmed's miners, professional silver miners from Serbia, dig tunnels toward the walls to collapse them from below. The defenders counter with an engineer, usually identified in later accounts as John Grant, possibly Scottish, possibly German, one of the strangest figures of the siege, who floods, burns, and fights the tunnels underground, until the mining campaign is abandoned. A giant siege tower is rolled toward the walls and destroyed in the night by barrels of gunpowder. Every Ottoman innovation is answered, but the defenders cannot replace a single man, and every day there are fewer of them. Then come the omens, and whatever a modern viewer believes about omens, the sources insist on them, and they tell us what the city was feeling. On May 22nd, a lunar eclipse darkens the moon, and the defenders remember an old prophecy that the city will stand while the moon is bright. The next day, or near it, the most sacred icon of the Virgin is carried in procession through the streets, and it slips from its platform. And then a storm of hail and rain breaks over the procession so violently that it is abandoned. The following morning, a fog settles on the city, unheard of in late May, and when it lifts at night, watchers on both sides report a strange glow playing about the dome of Hagia Sophia. In the Ottoman camp, the light is red as the faith of Islam descending on the city. Inside the walls, it is whispered that the spirit has departed the great church. The historian Stephen Runciman, whose classic account of the siege remains the standard narrative in English, records these portents as the sources give them. Some later researchers have suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions, possibly linked to a large volcanic eruption on the far side of the world around this period, could explain the strange skies. Though the dating of that eruption remains uncertain, and the connection is a hypothesis, not a finding, the city did not have even that consolation. The city believed heaven was saying goodbye. In these same days, a small Venetian ship slips back through the blockade. It had been sent out weeks earlier to find the great rescue fleet from the west. It returns with the answer: there is no fleet, Nothing is coming. By the account of Barbaro, the crew debated whether to sail home to safety, and instead voted to return to the doomed city to report to the emperor. Because they had given their word. Constantine, receiving the news, is described as thanking each man and weeping. In the Ottoman camp, there is also doubt. The siege is 7 weeks old. The walls still stand. Casualties are heavy, and rumors fly of a Hungarian army marching to relieve the city. Mehmed's senior vizier, by the Ottoman accounts, urges a negotiated withdrawal. The young Sultan instead offers Constantine final terms: surrender and depart alive, or the city takes the consequences of storm. Constantine's reply, as the Greek sources give it, does not change. The city is not his to surrender. Mehmed announces a general assault and promises his army, by the custom of the age, the plunder that law and tradition allowed a city taken by storm. May 28th is given to rest and preparation. The attack will come before dawn on the 29th. And now, the sources on both sides slow down, as if they know what they are carrying, and record the last day of the Roman Empire, almost hour by hour. May 28th. In the Ottoman camp, quiet, fires, prayer. Inside the city, something extraordinary happens. The bitter division that has poisoned the city for a decade, unionist against anti-unionist, Greek against Latin, simply dissolves. A great procession forms, icons and relics carried along the whole circuit of the walls, Greeks and Italians together, and in the evening, in Hagia Sophia, a service is held. The last Christian liturgy the great church would witness before the conquest and its conversion into a mosque. The accounts describe defenders coming down from the walls in shifts to receive communion. Orthodox and Catholic, praying together in the building where their churches had excommunicated each other. 4 centuries of schism suspended. For one night, at the end of the world, Constantinople asks forgiveness of his household and rides back to the walls in the dark. Even across 5.5 centuries, the sources from that night are difficult to read without emotion. The people in that church knew. 1:30 in the morning, May 29th. The assault begins along the entire land wall at once. Waves of irregulars first, spent against the stockades, then the Anatolian regiments, then, with the defenders exhausted and the sky beginning to pale, the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite. The fighting at the Lycus breaches is hand-to-hand on the barricades, and the defense, outnumbered beyond counting, holds. Barbaro, writing what he saw, describes the bells of the city ringing through the darkness and the walls fighting like a living thing. Then, in the grey of first light, the 2 blows fall within minutes of each other. A small sally port called the Kerkerporta, used for raids during the siege, is found, by the account of Ducas, left unbarred, and Ottoman soldiers pour into the space between the walls and raise their standards on a tower. Historians debate the Kerkerporta story, which appears fully only in Ducas. But something gave way at that corner of the line, and at the main breach, Justinian, the soul of the defense for 7 weeks, is struck by a shot and carried, bleeding and against the emperor's pleading, to his ship. The sources disagree on his wound and his choice, and Leonard of Chios never forgave him. But the effect is not disputed. The Genoese see their commander leave, and the line at the breach wavers, and the Janissaries come over the stockade. Of Constantine the 11th, last emperor of the Romans, the honest truth is that no reliable eyewitness saw his end. The accounts agree that when the line broke, he refused escape, threw off or was urged to throw off the imperial insignia, and went into the melee at the breach with his companions, and was not seen alive again. Later, stories grew that his body was known by the purple boots, that he was buried namelessly, that he sleeps in marble beneath the city, waiting to return. Those are legends, and we should call them legends. What the history records is simpler and harder. He had said he would die with the city of his own free will, and when the moment came, he did. He was 48 years old, and the line of emperors that began with Augustus ended where he fell. What followed, through that morning and the days after, was the sack that the laws of war then allowed, and the sources spare little. The eyewitnesses describe the killing of the first hours, the enslavement of a great part of the population, the stripping of churches and houses, families divided on the keys. And this series will not pretend otherwise, because the people it happened to were as real as you. At Hagia Sophia, the great doors were broken in upon a building packed with people praying for the miracle that did not come. By afternoon, Mehmed entered the city, rode to the great church, and, by the account of the chroniclers, was struck by grief at the ruin he saw, reciting Kritovulos and others report lines of Persian poetry about the spider keeping watch in the palace of kings. He ordered the church converted to a mosque, and days later halted the sack of the roughly 50,000 souls the city held. The sources describe the majority taken into captivity and thousands dead in the assault. Figures that, as always, with medieval numbers, historians report as approximations rather than counts. Tuesday, May 29th, 1453. In Greek folk memory, Tuesday is unlucky to this day. When the news reached the West, weeks later, contemporaries wrote that men wept in the streets of Venice and Rome. The scholar, Aeneas Sylvius, the future Pope, Pius II, wrote that it was a second death for Homer and Plato. A state that traced its history back more than 2,000 years had reached its final mourning, and the city was 3 days old in its next life, and did not yet know what it would become. Chapter 13. The City That Did Not Die. The final twist of this story is the one the 15th century itself would have found hardest to believe. The conquest of 1453, mourned across Europe as the death of the city, turned out to be the beginning of its next golden age. Constantinople had been a dying town of 50,000 inside a superpower's walls. Mehmed had not crossed all that history to rule a ruin. He had come, in his own mind, not to end an empire, but to claim one. The evidence is in what he did next. Within days of the conquest, Mehmed declared the city his new capital. He ordered resettlement on a massive scale. Muslims, Christians, and Jews transplanted from across his lands, some by incentive and some by decree. He appointed a new Greek Orthodox patriarch, the scholar Gennadios, a famous opponent of the union with Rome, and invested him with authority over the Orthodox population. A pragmatic arrangement that preserved the Greek Church under Ottoman rule for centuries. And he began to build a covered market that would grow into the Grand Bazaar, a great palace on the point where ancient Byzantium had stood. The palace later called Topkapi, and mosques, schools, and markets in every quarter. Mehmed styled himself, among his other titles, Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome. Kritovulos records him touring the ruins of the old palaces in melancholy, a conqueror mourning the thing he had conquered. The city changed faiths and masters. It did not change its destiny. It was, once again, the capital of the strongest empire in its neighborhood, and filling up with the future. One stream of newcomers deserves its own sentence. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, Ottoman lands became one of the principal destinations for the Sephardic Jews driven out of Iberia, and many families settled in Constantinople and in Salonika. Their descendants would print books, staff, counting houses, and speak a Spanish of the 15th century in the lanes of this city for the next 400 years. Constantinople had always been a city of many tongues. Istanbul would be too. A century after the conquest, the Ottoman city reached its noon under Suleiman, whom the West called the Magnificent, ruling from 1520 to 1566. Ottoman power stretched from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, and the capital, which the Turks in daily speech increasingly called Istanbul, a name most scholars trace to a Greek phrase meaning simply into the city, was again among the largest cities of Europe and the Mediterranean, with a population modern historians estimate in the hundreds of thousands, a scale it had not seen since Justinian. The skyline you see on postcards today was drawn in this age. Above all, by one man, the imperial architect Sinan, a military engineer of Christian birth recruited through the Ottoman levy system, who built, by the count of Ottoman records, hundreds of structures across the empire. His masterpiece in the capital, the Süleymaniye Mosque, answers Hagia Sophia across the skyline. A 1,000-year dialogue between two domes. The city of the Caesars and the city of the Sultans are not two cities. They are one city, wearing both crowns in turn. And then, because this is a long story and not a fairy tale, came the long middle centuries, the part most documentaries skip. They should not be skipped, because the city lived them the way it had lived everything else. Loudly, picture the city in, say, 1650. It is the seat of an empire that still frightens Europe. But the frontier victories are fewer now, and the palace is a stage for politics as lethal as anything in the Byzantine centuries. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's disciplined slave soldiers, have become a hereditary interest group with a taste for revolt, and more than one sultan will be deposed or killed by the very corps created to guard the throne. There is a grim symmetry in that. The city keeps recasting the same play with new actors. Praetorians, Hippodrome factions, Janissaries. The costumes change. The plot does not. Daily life, meanwhile, was inventing things the world now takes for granted. Coffee houses are traditionally said to have appeared in the city in the 1550s, and the institution spread through Istanbul generations before it reached London or Paris, alarming authorities, for exactly the reason coffee houses always alarm authorities. People sat in them and talked. The city burned, repeatedly and catastrophically, because it was built largely of wood. And great fires in the 17th and 18th centuries erased whole districts in nights, followed each time by rebuilding, because that is what this city does. Plague visited again and again into the 19th century, and through it all the city remained what the Ottomans had made it: a mosaic, Muslim, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish quarters. Several faiths burying their dead on the same hillsides. A commercial city where a dozen languages haggled in the same bazaar. It was a durable but unequal coexistence, ordered by rank and faith, and never free of tension. And it shaped the character of the city for centuries. By the 1800s, the empire was losing ground, and everyone knew it, including the empire. European powers began calling the Ottoman state the sick man of Europe while maneuvering over the inheritance. And the sultans answered with something unexpected: reform. In the era known as the Tanzimat, The reorganization, roughly the 1840s through the 1870s. The empire rewrote its laws, proclaimed the equality of its subjects regardless of faith, built modern schools, and remade the capital itself. Steamships crowded the Bosphorus. A railway arrived, and with it, in 1883, the Orient Express, delivering European travelers into a city that was becoming the most fashionable mystery in the world. Across the Golden Horn, the district of Pera, filled with embassies, department stores, and gaslight, the city was living in 2 centuries at once, and knew it, and made literature out of the feeling. It still does. The end of the empire, when it came fast. The Ottoman state chose the losing side in the First World War, and in 1918, for the first time since 1453, foreign warships anchored before the city, and Allied troops occupied Constantinople. Out of the wreckage, a Turkish national movement led by the general Mustafa Kemal, later given the name Ataturk, father of the Turks, fought the War of Independence and founded, in 1923, the Republic of Turkey. And then came a decision with 16 centuries of weight behind it. The capital moved, after more than 1,000 years as the throne of the Romans, and nearly 500 as the throne of the Ottomans. The city lost the imperial rank Constantine had given it in 330. The new republic ruled from Ankara, deliberately turning its back on the imperial past. In 1930, the Turkish authorities pressed foreign governments and postal services to adopt the name that local speech had used for generations. And in international usage, Constantinople became Istanbul. The Republic's first decades transformed the city's people as much as its name. The Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities that had defined whole districts for centuries dwindled across the 20th century. Through war, through the population exchange agreed between Greece and Turkey in 1923, through episodes of discrimination and violence, and through long waves of emigration. It is a painful history, remembered differently and mourned differently by the peoples who lived it, and it deserves far more than a single documentary can give it. The short truth is that the mosaic city became, within 2 generations, an overwhelmingly Turkish and Muslim one, even as it grew beyond anything the sultans had imagined. And the building at the center of this whole story changed with the times. Again, in 1935, by decree of the secular republic, Hagia Sophia ceased to be a mosque and opened as a museum. For the first time in its history, the great church of Justinian belonged to no single faith, and restorers began uncovering the golden mosaics that had been covered over in the Ottoman centuries, so that Christ and the calligraphy of Allah looked out from the same walls together. Exactly the image we began this journey with. Then, within our own memory, the pendulum moved again. In 2020, the Turkish government reconverted Hagia Sophia to a working mosque, a decision celebrated by many in Turkey and lamented by others there and abroad. And the debate about what this building should be, church, mosque, museum, monument to everyone, continues as you watch this. 15 centuries old, and still contested, because it still matters. So what is this city now? In 2026, it is often described as the largest city in Europe, home, by official counts, to more than 15 million people. Many times the population the medieval city held, even at its height, it famously spreads across 2 continents. And every day millions cross the Bosphorus by bridge, by tunnel under the sea, and by the same ferries whose ancestors have crossed these waters since Byzas. It is not the capital of Turkey, and it does not need to be. It is the economic and cultural heart of its nation, and one of the crossroads of the planet. And the strait it guards remains, in the headlines of our own decade, one of the most closely watched waterways on Earth. Governed by treaty, contested in every regional crisis, 27 centuries after the founding. The old joke about the land of the blind still holds its edge. Everyone can see what this place is worth. The past is not under glass here. It is underfoot. When engineers dug the Marmaray rail tunnel beneath the Bosphorus in the 2000s, the excavations at Yenikapı broke into the silted harbour of Theodosius and found dozens of Byzantine ships, preserved in the mud where they sank. One of the great finds in the history of nautical archaeology, and the construction schedule of a 21st century megaproject had to bend around the 4th century. That is, this city in one story. You cannot dig a hole in Istanbul without history flooding in. Stand with me one last time. Then, where we began, beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia. You know now what you are standing in. The church, Justinian, raised in 5 years on the ashes of a massacre. The building where Humbert slammed down his excommunication. Where the Crusaders of 1204 committed their sacrilege. Where the last emperor took communion at midnight while the guns waited outside. Where Mehmed recited poetry about the spider in the Palace of Kings. One building, holding all of it at once. At the start of this journey, I made you a claim that Rome did not simply fall, that it moved here and survived for another 1,000 years. Now you can judge it for yourself. The walls that deterred Attila and survived the armies of the Caliphate while the West struggled through its darkest centuries. The scribes whose copies carried a substantial share of Homer and Plato across 1,000 years to the desks of the Renaissance. The law code beneath the courtrooms of much of the modern world. The alphabet across Eastern Europe. The faith of hundreds of millions. The long argument, still running from Moscow to Washington, about what an empire owes the future. No single city made the modern world. But it is fair to say the modern world would be unrecognizable without what this one guarded. And passed on. Somewhere in Istanbul tonight, a ferry is crossing between Europe and Asia, and someone on the deck is watching the domes and the minarets and the lights on the water, feeling something they cannot quite name. 27 centuries of people have stood on these decks and felt it. The Greek colonist, the Roman legionary, the Varangian guardsman scratching his name in the marble, the janissary, the merchant, the refugee. The city has outlived every empire that owned it, every wall built to save it, every prophecy told about it. The empires fall, the city remains, and the water was here before any of them. If this story stayed with you, leave a thought below, and tell us which city you want to walk through next. Wherever it is, we will meet you there, at the edge of the water,